Hey everybody, welcome back to the next episode in my Creating a Great Tone series. I haven't done a video in this series in a while, mostly because I've covered most of the topics I wanted to talk about, but I am going to go back to my first video, like I did last year, and do a revised version of it. So last year I did Creating a Great Tone 2020 revised. I put in some of the changes I would make with some of the newer features that we have in the Helix. But today I'm going to take a little bit of a different twist on this Create a Great Tone series, but I think this is an extremely important video. A little background though, I did a video, how to create a great tone, about 4 years ago. That video has well over 100,000 views now. The follow-up to that has somewhere to the tune of 25 or 26,000 views. Along with those videos, I did templates, preset templates, let's say, that were designed to give people a starting point to put their own amp models into and tweak from there. And I kind of went through step by step explaining the process that I follow to make these templates. I uploaded those to CustomTone, and to date they have close to, I think, 18 or 19,000 downloads. So it's been a pretty successful series, and I've had literally thousands of messages over the years, people thanking me for the template, and I get tagged in posts where people say I use this template all the time, and it's really made a huge difference. But today I'm going to talk about it in a slightly different manner, because I still do get questions asking specifically why I approach things in certain ways within those preset templates. And I wanted to take a really interesting look at how and why I did the things I did in those. Now, the reason I wanted to do this is because I hear a lot of folks will make the comment that, oh, you know, with the Helix, you can't just pull up an amp and have it sound great. You have to do all this tweaking. You have to add EQ. You have to add compressors. You have to do this. You have to do that. And I've tried to be clear throughout all of my videos that the things I do, I'm not doing because I have to do them because they're somehow different than the real world. It's just how I've always worked. And we have those tools at our disposal, and why not use them to get the best sounding product we can? And I hope with what I'm going to show today, it's going to show that the way I use the Helix is really not much different than the old school, we'll call it, real world way of working. First, before I go any further though, I'm going to play you a little piece of music I composed and recorded. I'm not going to tell you anything about how I recorded it until we come back and go over to Cubase and take a look at what's actually going on. So give that a listen first. All right, so what did you guys think? Toontrack's Superior Drummer and Toontrack's Easy Bass for the rhythm section. And then there's about 8 guitars kind of layered in there. I shouldn't say 8 guitars because they're not all playing at the same time. Usually the most is like 5 guitars. There's a couple rhythms with a couple other little sweetener parts and a main lead and some harmonies. So anyways, just what I would consider maybe a normal production in how I work, whether I'm doing studio work for others or just working on my own composing music. So now that we've heard that, let's go over to Cubase and take a look and see what I actually did and what's going on. All right, so here we are over at Cubase, and you'll notice I have this little piece of music ready to go. I have the rhythm section just bounced down to drums and bass. It sounds like this. Wonderful. Okay, so that works nicely. I have all of my rhythm guitar parts after that. As you can see, guitars 1 through 8. These two here are my main rhythm parts. These two are kind of like little sweetener percussive parts. You'll notice guitar 5 comes in over here just as like a harmony. It's an octave down, I believe, to the main melody. Guitar 6 is literally one little phrase that's a harmony to the main lead, which is right here on guitar 7. And then I have the outro solo as guitar 8. So as you can see, there's 8 guitars, but really for the most part, 4 of them are playing at once, and then you have a lead over top of that with the odd little harmony part. Okay, so you might ask, how did I do this? You see down here that there's an instance of Helix Native open on every single one of these tracks, but this is not what you think. These guitars were all recorded with a real guitar through a real microphone, recorded through a really nice mic preamp, through a really nice analog compressor, basically the old school way of doing things, which I wanted to show that the way that I work in the Helix and in that template, as I mentioned before, is really no different than the real world way I would have worked back in the days when I had a full-blown recording studio. This is going to show right back to basics. This is how albums used to be made. We set up a good microphone in front of a great amplifier. We put it into a great mic preamp. We maybe compressed it a bit, maybe EQ'd it a bit on the way in, and then we did whatever we had to do at mixdown. So all I do in my template or in creating tones on the Helix is follow that same path. So what is that path? Well, I started with my Ravv Generator 100R amplifier, a wonderful amp from the fine folks at Ravv Amplification. That's going into my Ravv 212 cabinet with vintage 30 speakers. I just put up an impulse response package I shot of that using some really nice equipment. It's available on the Line 6 marketplace, and you can find the link below if you're interested in that. I've had some great feedback on that. I started with my Vigier Expert guitar plugged into this. I dialed in a tone the best I could, the way I wanted it to sound in the room, got it sounding really nice. Now, for miking this, I have a couple things going on. I used a Warm Audio, a new company that I'm doing some work with, a Warm Audio WA47 Junior microphone, which is kind of in the camp of a Neumann U47 mic. I use that for all of the rhythm guitars. Then for the leads, I used a Warm Audio WA251, which is kind of a recreation of the old classic Telefunken 251. It's a tube microphone. These are really nice microphones, very, very high quality, very nice sounding mics. I recorded all of those into a Warm Audio WA273 EQ mic preamp and EQ, which is in the style of a Neve 1073, a very highly regarded classic mic pre and EQ. And then that went into a Warm Audio WA76 compressor, which is an 1176 style compressor. So by the time these guitars hit, we'll call it tape, but into the DAW, into Cubase, they'd already been treated in this manner. I got the tone I wanted at the amplifier. I set up a microphone, positioned it very carefully and accordingly. I can't stress that enough. Moving a microphone even an inch or two either way, front, back, side to side, is going to change dramatically the tone that we get out of it. So I carefully positioned those microphones, recorded a little bit, listened back, placed those microphones until I got the sound I wanted out of them. Then I carefully set the mic pre to get the amount of input and output out of that I want. I added a little touch of EQ with the Neve style EQ on the WA273. And then I added just a little bit of compression like I always do, a couple dB, maybe 3 dB at the most at a 4:1 ratio on the WA76s. So by the time this came into Cubase, it was sounding in a manner that I really enjoyed. Now, do I know that's going to work in the final mix perfectly? Well, no, because I hadn't layered everything in, but I got it really close. So really, if you say, well, why are we talking about this? Well, would that not be like creating a preset on the Helix in my template where we say, well, let's start off by adding an amplifier and a cabinet. What amp do we want? Well, that's going to be our personal preference and our choice. What cabinet do we want? Well, again, that's going to be personal choice, and you're going to have to go through, find the most appropriate ones depending on what you're trying to accomplish in that particular situation. Once you have that, we can then go in the Helix and choose a microphone for that cabinet. I've done many videos about this. different microphones. In fact, I have a whole Dialing In series microphone edition, which I'm going through, and I'll have more episodes of that coming. So we choose that, and we decide how far back we want it. Now, the one drawback in the Helix is we can't put that microphone on or off axis. It must be right where they have it, and we can move it from 1 to 12 inches back, but that's an extremely powerful tool. So once we've dialed that in, dialed our amp in with our tone stack, getting it sounding the way we want, we now would be kind of up to the point where I'm at with these raw guitar tracks that I have here in Cubase. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bypass all these inserts. Now I can do that by coming off screen here, hitting Alt and hitting the insert button. And you'll notice that all the instances of Helix Native have been turned off. So watch that again. They go from blue, they're on, and then they're off when I click the bypass insert. Now, the reason I'm doing this is I want you to hear the guitar tracks as they came into Cubase. So this again is my Vigier Expert guitar into my Ravv Generator 100R, set exactly the way I want it, into a Ravv 212 cabinet with vintage 30 speakers, mic'd with either a Warm Audio WA47 Junior or a WA251, into a Neve style WA273 preamp and EQ, into a WA76 1176 style compressor. So a very nice recording chain. I spent time positioning the microphones, EQing a very little tiny bit and adding just a little bit of compression. And this is what we end up with now. I'm going to solo the guitars out, and they're going to be panned as they sit in the mix. But remember, this has no other processing. Helix Native that I use to process in the mix is completely bypassed. So here is the first rhythm guitar part. If I go back now and I'll show you the second rhythm guitar part, recorded with the same microphone, but this is going to be panned to the other side now. If I put them both together, we get this. I was really liking those tones, very warm sounding. Really though, I don't feel that that isn't anything I could have accomplished in the Helix with no other processing. Kind of just if I had the same idea, just an amp, a cab, choose the mic, move it to where I want it, maybe add a dab of compression afterwards, I'm probably going to end up with something very similar to that. But this is a beautiful tone. I was very happy with it. Now, am I going to have to do something with it in the mix to make it work? Very likely. Even though this is a real amp in the room with this beautiful recording chain, it's probably still going to need work to sit. Now let's listen to that with the rhythm section. Now you can probably see why I decided on that. When I was listening to it with the rhythm section, I was like, that sounds pretty good. Could it be better? Well, it probably could be, but we'll deal with that in a couple minutes. Now, if I unsolo all of those, again, everything's bypassed here. I also added these two little percussive sweetener parts to the rhythms as well. So I'm going to play you both of these. These are panned kind of out left and right. One part in a higher octave, one part in a lower octave, and they complement each other quite nicely. Same recording chain with some slightly different settings though on the compressor. Slightly faster attack here. So it kind of kept those percussive notes under control. Here's what that sounds like. All right, so that's what we have for that. Now, after that, I moved down to the lead guitars, and I did my main lead guitar. This time, Different settings on the amplifier, obviously, for all of these parts. The main 2 rhythm parts had slightly different settings. The 2 percussive parts had slightly different settings. My main lead, obviously, is going to be a more slightly overdriven tone. But this is it without any processing as it came out of the real amp, real mic preamp, real mic, real compressor, and whatnot. So this is how this sounds completely unprocessed. Now right here, I add in a little harmony. And then I do kind of an octave lower doubling of the main melody for what I would call the chorus part. Okay, fine. So we'll unsolo all that. So let's take a listen to how all of that sounds in the mix without any other processing other than, like I said already a bunch of times, the real guitar amp, mic preamp, a little bit of compression, straight into the DAW, in this case, Cubase 11 Pro, and it sounds like this. What do you think? I mean, I like it. It's very dry. It's very warm sounding. But now you might be wondering, what does this have to do with creating a great tone in the Helix? Well, it has everything to do with it because here we have the most real situation we can have. Now, could I have added more high end in or less mids or more bass at the amplifier itself? I absolutely could have. I then could have placed the microphone in different places. But with the information I had at the time, listening in the mix and hearing these tones, I was pretty happy with what I got down on tape. Now, this is a real world situation. When a mix engineer gets tracks like this, they very seldom will just put them in and go, okay, they're perfect. We don't need to do anything. In fact, the tools that mix engineers use are things such as compressors and equalizers and other sweetening tools. But I would say for the most part, we're going to be manipulating dynamics by using a compressor, or we're going to be manipulating frequencies from an equalizer and boosting or cutting and just getting things to fit the mix better, kind of carving out sonic spaces for everything. Now, I was actually pretty happy with the way this all sounded. I did process the drums and bass, obviously. I actually processed them through the analog equipment, the same things. I ran them through the 273 pre's and EQs and the compressors, and I got a nice fat sound out of them. I was pretty happy with that. But so now what I would say, if I pull up Helix Native here, and what I'm going to do is just unbypass all these. So you see now they're engaged. So I'm going to pull up Helix Native on the first rhythm guitar track. And now you're going to see something similar to what I would have had in one of my templates. I'm just kind of moving these closer together. So first things first, there's no amp and cab block. Well, obviously not. I've already taken care of that in the real world. So in the case of my template, I would have an amp and a cab block. Now, obviously, you could have whatever other effects you wanted in there, if you wanted chorus or tremolo or any of the other sweetener effects, but that's not what the template is about. It's about getting a good core tone. So the first thing I have is a low and high cut. And what I did here, and I believe I did it on all the guitars, is I low cut 100 hertz and I high cut 12 kilohertz. Main reasons are, as we would do in the Helix, and there's always been a lot of discussion about, should we use low and high cuts? If a guitar speaker only reproduces frequencies up to 5 or 6 kilohertz, shouldn't we high cut down to there? Well, there's always going to be excess information when recording a real guitar amp in those frequency areas that maybe we don't need. Maybe it's going to get in the way of the cymbals or in the way of the kick drum and bass. So, standard, I might come in just like in my template and, low cut 100 hertz, high cut 12 kilohertz. It doesn't make a massively drastic difference, but it does help it to sit in the mix. So that would be one part that I would use either in the cab block or in a parametric EQ. And a lot of times I have that done in the parametric EQ at the end. So I could just as easily move this over here as well. Probably not going to notice a huge difference. You would notice it on the Ravv then, but if you notice, I already have a high cut on the Ravv at 4.6 kilohertz. So is it really going to make a difference over there? Probably not, but you can put it there. I have it there in my template. Next, what I did is I used the low and high shelf EQ, just like I always use in almost all of my presets. I set both the low frequency and high frequency to 650 hertz. I cut all the frequencies below 650 hertz by 2 dB and boosted all the frequencies above 650 hertz by 1 dB. Then I wanted a little more ambience to it, a little more verb. So I went to a plate reverb with a decay of 4.5, pre-delay of 15 milliseconds. Low and high cut I left as they come up, and a mix of 28%. Now you'll notice that the LA Studio comp at the end, which I always have in my template, is bypassed. Well, there's good reason for it. I tried it with it on, but here's the thing. I actually compressed this on the way in with a compressor with some character. I found that recompressing it in this particular situation didn't work, but that's very different than my template, because in my template, the template's not set up to have a compressor going in. It's set up to have compression at the end, which I used as glue to glue everything together. But I didn't need it in this case. So that's the one slight difference from my template. But you will see that under normal circumstances, if I had not used the compression going in and recording that onto tape, I would have absolutely added a little bit of LA Studio Comp in the same way I did with the sound coming in. Just 2 dB, 3 dB of compression, very subtle to get some of the character from that compressor. But since I have that, you'll notice I have that bypassed on all of these tracks. Now you might say, well, how does this sound? Well, let's do this. Let's bypass all of the blocks in Helix Native and start our track again. Now I'm going to solo the rhythm guitar one that this is on. And we'll take a listen to this, and then I will engage each block as we go to see what this does to our sound. Now to get a little bit more noticeable, what I'll do is up here, I will bypass the entire Helix Native instance as we're listening to this. Do you notice it just has a little more clarity, slightly less mud? Obviously, the reverb adds some ambience, and it kind of just comes together in a much nicer fashion. So let's get rid of that one now, and we'll go over to our next track, and we'll do the same thing. So this is the Rhythm Guitar 2 now, and I'll bypass these blocks. And if you notice, I did some very similar stuff here. Same reverb, very close, if not the same settings on the low and high shelf, and same settings on the low and high cut. But let's just bypass this, listen to this track, and I'll bring these all in at the same time. Again, it just kind of brings it to life and gives it a little more clarity. Now what I'll do is I'll solo guitars 3 and 4, the little percussive parts. Here's the parts with no other processing, and then I will unbypass Helix Native so you can hear what those same settings do for these parts. Great, and I think we hear how those come to life. So now if I come over here and show you what I did on Helix Native. Very similar stuff again. Same low and high cuts, similar moves on the low and high shelf, which worked really nicely. And on this, instead of using a plate reverb, I used a room reverb with these settings. All right, great. So let's listen now to all 4 of those rhythm tracks. I'm going to play those for you with Helix Native bypassed, and then as it's playing, I'm going to bring the Helix Native tweaks that I put in, much like I would have done in my template. Now, one thing to point out, I do have a limiter at the end which boosts the volume up a little bit here, which is something that maybe I will just disengage for this. So even when I disengage the limiter, you hear there's a real clarity that comes to everything with those little tiny moves I made. Now, this has nothing to do with the Helix. This has to do with a real guitar amp, real microphone, real preamps, the old school back to basics way of working. And I still wanted to add these tweaks in. It's not because the Helix needs it. It's because the guitars need it, in my opinion. Maybe somebody else would have just said, no, we didn't need any of that. I liked it the way it was. They're not wrong and I'm not wrong. It's really down to personal preference. And I think, though, in the end result of this with the mix the way I did it, it came out sounding pretty good. So now let's move on over to our lead guitars. And I'm going to come over to my main lead guitar 7 here. Let's take a listen to this. As we already listened to it, Helix Native bypassed, no other processing. Okay, now how did I process that? Same low and high cut, slightly different settings on the low and high shelf. Now I was using a different microphone on this and it was a different tone. I did take all the frequencies below 650 hertz, cut those by 1 dB, and all the frequencies above 650 hertz and boost them by 0.5 dB. I added my favorite transistor tape delay, which is another part of my template. Whether you turn it on or off is up to you. Set to a quarter note at the tempo of the song, how I always set my delays, so that they actually work in tempo with the song. Feedback at 23% and mix level of about 27%. And on this, I went with a Hall reverb with a decay of 5, pre-delay of 22 milliseconds, and a mix of 35%. Again, I opted to put the LA Studio Comp off for this simply because I've already compressed these with a nice character compressor going in. I've already got that on there. But if I hadn't, like I mentioned before, I would definitely have the LA Studio Comp on. And maybe I'll turn it on to let you hear what it sounds like. So again, I am going to unbypass all of the instances of Helix Native, but I will bypass this one. Let's take a listen with it off. And then when I click up here on the yellow button and it goes back to gray, then it's going to be engaged. You can hear what all of these different blocks are doing to the sound. Do you hear the difference? Now, if I take this, I'll go back and I will bring in the compressor as well in Helix Native. In this case, because it was already compressed on the way in when I was recording it, I just find that that added way too much compression. I didn't want it on in this case. If I hadn't compressed it on the way in, I absolutely would have put that on. But again, you notice it never really got up past about 3 dB of gain reduction, mostly hovering around 1.5 to 2 dB, but we're going to have that off. All right, so now here's what we want to do. We want to take a listen to this entire mix. with and without the processing. So what I'm going to do for this, I'm going to actually get rid of the volume boost that I was getting out of my limiter here. So the volume will be a little bit lower, but the comparison will be a little bit better. So if I go up and I simply bypass all of my Helix native instances, I will play you the mix with the rhythm section, and then I will hit the insert button so that all of the Helix native instances come back on. You'll hear what those small tweaks I made to every track have done to these tones in the mix. And like I said, this is going to apply whether we're talking about in the studio or live. Here's how that sounds. What did you think? Kind of an interesting comparison. Very subtle changes with the same kind of blocks I would use in my template after the amp and cab block, after making the appropriate settings on those. But when we went to the mix and we kind of brought all of those little changes in together on all of the different tracks, I found the mix just had more clarity to it. The tone sat nice, and it was a more pleasant mix to listen to. We had some ambience on there. It wasn't so dry. So why did I do this video? Well, it was to really show that using the Helix is really, in my estimation and in my opinion, no different than working as I would in the real world. And that's a point I've made in the past. And it's lost on a lot of folks. And you know, it's very interesting, and I don't say this to criticize anybody, but over the years in talking to so many folks about, you know, dialing in tones and modeling and whatnot, you come to the realization, and folks will say like, well, I've never played through a real tube amp. I've never owned a real tube amp. I mean, many folks who do use modeling own to this day many tube amps and grew up with them, much like I did. But there are a large number of folks who have never actually played through a real tube amp. They don't really know the ins and outs of even making that sound a certain way. And again, that's no criticism. That's just circumstance, and that's fine. But what a beautiful time we live in for everybody to be able to access these wonderful tones from using any of the amazing modelers that are available today. Another thing is there's a lot of folks that I've talked to who, even though they've owned many tube amps and played through many, they've never recorded a tube amp like I just did here to make a real production. I grew up doing that from the time I was about 12 years old. I was fascinated by recording guitar tones. Call me strange. I was the weird kid that was doing that rather than doing other cool things at the time, I guess. But I was very fascinated with that. And I started that at a very early age and really researched and learned a lot of the ins and outs on how to do that in a manner that's going to be useful and the things that need to be done to get it to work. So I take all of that and I bring that to the Helix and I say, this is how I'm going to work. I'm just going to pretend that the Helix is the real world. Oh, okay. I have an amp. I have the appropriate cab that I want, and I have this microphone selection, and I can move that microphone around a little bit. Be nice to move it around more, granted. I'm going to get that sounding really good. You know, I'm going to move the tone stack around, bass, treble, mids, whatever controls I have in the amp. All right, that's sounding pretty good now. But you know, it's still kind of missing something to really work in the mix live or in the studio. Well, let's add the sweeteners in. Just like I would be doing in the DAW, I can now do that in the Helix. I'm going to add maybe a little bit of low and high cut to have it sit in the mix. Maybe make some room for the cymbals or the kick and the bass guitar. I'm going to add a little bit of low or high shelf EQ, or maybe a parametric EQ, or maybe a tilt EQ, whatever tool you think it needs. And I have templates with the tilt EQ, with the shelf EQ. I always have a parametric EQ in there just in case I need it for certain more surgical frequencies that I may want to boost or cut. Then we add some reverb and delay, much like in my template. Maybe we've added those at the source. Some people record those with their guitar because they have a favorite reverb pedal. That's fine too. And then, well, in the template, guess what? You would probably take it out unless you needed to add more. And then finally, the compressor. I added it on the way in. Here, I always like to add it on the way out to act more like a mastering section, like I've said a bunch of times before. So, you know, working in that way is really no different than the real world, and this idea that the Helix needs it because, you know, the amps are no good. I think we heard today I had a really great amp, really great guitar, really great recording chain. The guitars sounded fine, but I wanted something a little different, so I used these extra sweetening tools. So I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I thought it was kind of a fun one to make, just to kind of have this comparison to what working in the real world is and, you know, used to be like for everybody who worked in studios with just real equipment. You know, I was doing this back in the day when modelers were not even a thought. I mean, we had a guitar amp, you had a microphone, and you had to get it onto your recording medium some way, and hopefully it was going to sound good. So you learned real quick moving that microphone around, and all these other things were going to be important to getting the end product that you desired. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Please like the video, share it with anybody who you think would get use out of it, and please subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I will be back really soon with some more content. Thank you guys again so much for tuning in. Ciao for now.